So here again, back after spring break and PhD and everything else. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Anna Brasso, who's working at IFIT here on, well, I was about to say here on campus, but she's actually working off. So she came to campus for us today. We really appreciate that. I'm actually going to let you start there and introduce yourself.
Yeah.
First, maybe.
Yeah, that's fine. So I'm Anna Braswell. I'm an assistant professor in fisheries and aquatic sciences, and we are actually at Millhopper campus, which is near Devil's Millhopper. So we live in the Wild West, but we're pretty close. I'm also a state extension specialist with Florida Sea Grant, so I have a dual appointment and straddle both worlds. And today I'm going to be talking to you about understanding hazard as a product of biophysical and social components. So trying to understand hazard and how damage happens is thinking about the two things together versus apart. So let's get started. I'm going to take you through a couple projects today, and just to give you an outline of where I'm going. First thing that we're going to talk about is growth into hazardous areas. So thinking about how people in the US have developed places of hazard, what that means going forward with the way that we do policy. The second thing is taking one type of hazard in particular. I'm a coastal scientist. I prefer the coast. So I'm going to talk to you about exposure along our coastlines and what that means for coastal adaptation. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about the template. So we all live in this beautiful landscape, and we have our natural systems, but we can all be honest with one another that humans have totally changed that system. And so how has the alteration of that template changed hazard? And this is like the most new work, and so it's kind of more of a question and a direction that I'm heading towards. So to start with, I'm just going to introduce you guys to a little bit what I'm talking about. So here's a lovely house. It's in Dauphin Island, Alabama. It's for sale. I think most of us in this room would agree that it's probably in a pretty hazardous area. It has this lovely seawall that protects it and piers that it's on to keep the waves from crashing into the actual house. And this house was actually on an HGTV show called Buying the Beach, and it sold to this lovely couple for $349,000. And I think we probably all in this room can agree that this is probably not the best purchase, and yet it is on our national TV. And we're celebrating it as buying a home on the beach. So to me, the first thing that rings here is like, okay, what's happening here? Are we, educating ourselves well enough about what hazard looks like and where we should be buying and not buying? I'd also like to point out that Dauphin Island, Alabama is a place that has been hit by many a hurricane and is a very eroding landscape, and is not, it's just not a great place to buy a house, period. So. And I also wanted to talk to you about Houston. So Houston's another example of where we've developed into places that are natural ecosystems that might provide some sort of flood protection. And so this is a picture of Houston, an aerial image of Houston in 1986. And if you flip to 2017 and you just kind of blur your eyes a little bit and look at the green and the gray, you can see that there's a lot of gray moving into green spots. And what they found since Hurricane Harvey is that the development and the largely unregulated development in Houston moved a lot of people into places that were previously wetlands or previously flooded areas. And that means that we were putting people in places of hazard. So these are just two examples of where we have this conundrum of a clearly present hazard or a clearly protective space like a wetland that might absorb some water, and we're actively developing them. This has meant that our hazard dollars and the amount of expense that our country pays for natural disasters has been going up. So this is the number of billion-dollar disasters from 1980 to 2020, and they're color-coded by the different types of disasters. So you'll see that the green severe storm is a large proportion of this, but you can also see that it's just an increasing number of billion-dollar disasters. And this is actually coming from the President's National Economic Report that just came out last week that is talking about what is happening in our country with hazard and ways to move forward, which is great that we're starting to get some traction at that on the federal government. We also can talk about how climate is increasing hazard frequency and intensity. And these are some recent studies looking at heat waves and the number of heat waves per decade and the length of heat waves, and showing that there could be some attribution of climate to the ways that a number of heat waves and the length of heat waves happened in more recent years, and that they're increasing. We can also again go back to Hurricane Harvey and look at the intensity of Hurricane Harvey, and another study has attributed a 20% increase in extreme precipitation to climate. So more recent studies have really started to try to look at, okay, how is our hazard changing with climate, and what does that mean for both the length, the intensity, and the frequency of these hazardous events. But when we start to look at the measures of intensity or the measures of size of a hazard, we can see that it doesn't explain the whole story. So this is looking at hurricanes. We have maximum wind speed and minimum pressure, two measures of the strength of that hurricane. And then plotted on it are the number of billions of dollars that each event costs and the number of deaths. And you can see that there's a wide range of expensive events across these, common measures of intensity of a hurricane. There do seem to be some of the more expensive ones that are up towards the top, but we still have very expensive events that are down towards the bottom. When we look at wildfires, this becomes even more convoluted. So the number of fires is like the number of small fires within an event in the area burned. So again, two measures of intensity. And while there are some expensive events where you would expect them with high area burned and high number of fires, we see that like one of the most expensive events is a very low number down here. So this means that even though the hazards could be high, there is something about where people are living, where people are moving to, that causes these damage expenses. So it's just not the combination of that hazard, it's also where those people are and how we're developing those areas that cause these billion-dollar disasters. So if we think about this within a framework of risk, what is the risk of a hazard? The IPCC made this lovely infographic, I'll call it, that really makes risk of hazard the combination of the hazard itself. So what is the event, the vulnerability of that area to the hazard, and the exposure. And so today, I really want to talk about impacts and how climate can change a hazard, but also how these socioeconomic processes can change the exposure, or the movement of people into a place of hazard. And when we start to think about that with the combination of the environmental system and the social system and how those two things go together to create these billion-dollar events, we can think about amplifying and dampening relationships between these things. So if we were to take a rare storm, say a Hurricane Harvey, for instance, and then we have the driver, so that's that rare storm in the environmental system, and we have the response, which would be the flooding. And because the way we built, we might amplify, or the orange arrow, to become a more intense flooding event. And this connects to our social system with flood losses and a possible response. So we can see that if we start like moving ourselves through this with a particular hazard, that depending on what the template is, where people live, we might have different responses to the same rare storm, depending on if you have built in a certain area or not, or if you have certain types of water control structures or not. And then these things all feed back on each other after a storm as this template changes itself and people react to that particular disaster. Okay, so I've given you a little bit of a background about where this is all coming from. I'm going to jump into this growth of into hazardous areas, looking across the whole country and several different types of hazards to start to develop what have we done in the past developing hazardous areas. And how have the most hazardous zones in the US developed? Okay, so to do this, we started using Zillow. So I think everybody knows about Zillow from their housing. We go on Zillow, we look at Zillow on our phones to see how much does this house cost, does it have a pool? But Zillow is also a really powerful data collector. And they have created contracts with some universities to share that data. And what they do is they go in and they web scrape all of the county's websites that they can, or municipalities' websites that they can, to develop a database that basically tells you where a house is, where it's built, and then anything that they can get from like, what are the walls made of, to what is the roof structure like. So it's a really, really powerful database. And so it allows us to go back in time based on the year built from 1810 to 2015, and then also collect some of those housing characteristics where we can, based on where those parcels are. So we've made a lot of this data publicly available at HISTAC at the Harvard Dataverse, because it's a proprietary database, but our team has been taking that data and turning it into rasters that take out some of the privacy and the proprietary concerns that Zillow had, and it's made it publicly available. So if you're interested, you can check that out there. So we're using this to track how people have developed into hazardous areas through time. Oh, and this is just an example. So this is going back from 1810 to current times, and you can see from the east to the west, the development of parcels. So anytime a grid cell lights up, it is a parcel being developed, and the more intense red and orange colors are more developed parcels, so they have more housing structures in them. So you can really see this increase across the country going from east to west, and the coastlines really developing up. And then after World War II, it really picks up in pace as those parcels, as the country develops more as a whole after World War II. But it just gives you an idea of what I mean by this data set that we're using. Okay, so we took that Zillow data, and then we also developed a hazard data. So this is hazard layers in the 90th percentile probability of intensity hazard. So we're talking about the most hazardous areas that we could find for each types of hazards. So we looked at earthquake hazards, flood hazards, hurricane hazards, the tornado hazards, and then fire. And we either took the probability of a hazard, or in some cases probability. We couldn't have probability data, so we used the intensity as a way to track the most hazardous places. And we came up with this map. So this is the 90th percentiles, again, for each one of these hazards, going from earthquake, wildfire, flood, hurricanes, and tornadoes. And what you might expect is that there are some very clear geographic patterns in this, where our coastlines are really dominated by hurricane on the east coast and earthquake hazard on the west coast. We have this nice central United States belt of tornado hazard. Wildfire tends to be in more forested areas in the west coast and places like Florida. And then river is hard to see, but there's a small blue modeling along most of the major rivers, particularly in the east coast, where there's flooding hazard. So this was the map that we were looking at for determining how people develop these areas. And so the data I'm going to show you are really talking about two simple metrics of development. The first is expansion. So what I mean by expansion is when you take an already existing community, say these 4 houses here, and it expands out into like a larger community, it takes up more land, right? So this is a good example of urban or suburban sprawl. You have an already existing city, you start to sprawl like the suburbs, and you become a more expansive city. The second measure is just increasing density. So it's taking smaller houses and turning them into more dense structures, whether that be a condo or multiple smaller structures on one parcel, but it's just increasing the density of units or houses or properties in that area. So these are the two basic measures that we used for looking at this question. Okay, so I'm going to get you into the data, and I just want to explain this graph real quick before, because we're going to see a couple of these before I keep going. So this is just structure density on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, and the different colors are the different hazards, but I also want to point out this black dashed line, which is just the country as a whole. So what we're doing is comparing these different hazardous areas to what the country is developing as a whole to see if they are more or less developed than what we would expect just looking at development across the entire country. And so what we see is that, as you might expect, places that are along the coast or hazardous areas along the coastlines, like this pinky lines here for the earthquakes and the gray line for the hurricanes, have higher structured density across the entire time period than the country as a whole. So they have more structures in those hazardous areas, whereas wildfires, tornadoes, and flood do not. So again, there's clear geographic patterns to these hazards, and so this is really showing up here. When we start to look at densification and expansion, so densification is the relative measure of expansion to density. So it tells you if you're really adding structures relative. And it's like, okay. Give me 2 seconds, everybody. It wouldn't be a presentation without doing something like this, would it? Okay, I'm just going to do this. Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay, and then expansion again is that suburban sprawl. So we see that again, the same things with densification, these two hazards, earthquakes and hurricanes, are really showing that they're adding density, they're adding structure to this area versus the other ones, and it versus the country as a whole. Whereas the expansion, we start to see things like tornadoes come into play. So possibly showing that places in the Midwest, the communities are growing in those hazardous areas. They're not necessarily developing more houses on their parcels, but they're growing and expanding in those hazardous areas. And when we can start to pick this apart a little bit more to try to determine like what types of development are happening in this area, or in these hazards. So this is taking earthquakes, and we've just outlined a couple of places that are the main cities that these hazardous areas fall over. And what the different colors are denoting high density. So this would be like a city, an urban area, intermediate density, which is suburban, and low density, which is rural. So earthquakes are dominated by kind of this intermediate and high density with very little rural development, and that those are what are really driving these density in these hotspots. And we see the same thing with hurricanes, very similar picture, where you have the density driven by these intermediate and high density environments with less so in the low density. But when we start to look at wildfire and tornado, we can see a really, really different picture. So these hazards are again happening, for instance, with wildfire in more forested areas. And we can see that with these rural areas here that are really growing in structure density versus for tornadoes, it's very similar, where we have more of this intermediate suburban area than not as much in the high density. So this can show us that there are different types of development going on, and that the ways that we structure our policies and regulations around development might depend on what types of hazards we're thinking about. So for instance, if we were thinking about a hurricane, we might think about, okay, maybe we shouldn't add more density to these areas because that seems to be the main thing that's happening, versus some of these other hazards such as wildfires. It's clearly we want to kind of restrict the amount of land that we're developing into these hazardous areas. And we also did a little case study looking at, okay, we know that this is all dependent on data. This is a bunch of exercise that just depends on all of these different data sources coming together. So what does that mean for what we're saying here, and how do the structure, or how do the changes that humans make to these hazards change the way that we can predict risk in these areas? So this is looking at two watersheds in the Sacramento River Delta, in this red and this blue here, and then across two different flood frequencies. So we took the 100-year flood and the 500-year flood, so a more frequent and a really less frequent flooding event. And we modeled it for the undefended. So in the undefended, there's no levees, there's no infrastructure to stop flooding, and the defended. And then we looked at the difference between the two. And what we found is that at the 100-year flood, that the defended areas did a lot better. And then you can see that in the red, that there are areas that didn't have water because of those levees and were protected from that 100-year flood. But when we go to this 500-year flood, those differences start to disappear. And that's because those levees are made for a 100-year flood. They're not made for that 500-year flood. And so if we start thinking about, okay, where are we putting people? And people are allowed to build behind those levees because they are provided some sort of protection. We might be starting to see in the future that if we have more frequent, more intense events, that they're not going to be as protected in these 500-year flooding events. And then we can also look at that here across these two watersheds, where we have one, the blue has no levees in it, the red has levees, and you can see when we do a defended one in B and an undefended one in C, that the risk goes way up through time after those levees happen. When we start to look at the differences between those areas. Okay, so just to wrap up what we've talked about here, growth into hazardous areas depends on the geography, the topography, and where cities occur. So it's really different depending on which hazard you're talking about and what types of development are happening in that hazard area. And exposure is increasing, but different. So there's some places that it's really rural and it's expansion, but other areas where it's densification, and that can really change the way we think about that on a policy level. Okay, next I'm going to talk about our exposure along our coastlines and how has exposure changed along our coastlines over time. and try to think about what that means again for our coastlines. Again, I'm a coastal scientist. This is what I want to talk about. So we again look at this amount of money that we spend on different types of hazards. You can see that this whole kind of half of the pie here is for flooding, coastal hazards, and hurricanes. So a lot of the money that we're putting into hazards happens on our coastlines. And so that's what makes it really important to kind of try to figure out what's going on and what we can do better there. And with sea level rise, this is likely to increase in the future as places that were outside of chronic flooding zones come into chronic flooding zones. And that's starting to happen along our coastlines here. I saw another picture of one in Volano Beach today that was up on huge stilts, and erosion had happened, and it was clear that that house needed to be demolished, but it was for sale. So what does that mean for us? This is also another study that looked at what do we do after hazards. So the gray distributions here are all pre-hazard, and the colored distributions are all post-hazard. It's looking across multiple communities after multiple hurricanes and looking at the footprint of the buildings that they put back in. And you can see that most of the distributions shift bigger after a hurricane, showing that after a hurricane, we're building back bigger. We're not just putting in the same house, we're putting in bigger houses. So why are we doing this? Why are we putting ourselves in danger? Okay, so again, we use Zillow data here, and we address two key questions. How the built environment of US coastlines changed over the past century. So what have we done to develop our coastlines? And based on our analysis, are they becoming more exposed to coastal disasters, and kind of where are we becoming more exposed? So again, I'm looking at these two measures of expansion. So the growing communities, the suburban sprawl, and the densification, or the adding of more buildings, the adding of more units to a parcel. And we use the sea level rise zones as an indicator of places that this hazard was going to be in the future, or places that were already experiencing flooding. So we use the six foot sea level rise zone that you can see here in blue. And this is just showing you an example of expansion. So this is Fort Myers, and you can see the gray kind of growing into that area and taking over from 1900 to 2015, whereas Los Angeles is a really good example of densification. So if you compare the two, you see there's like a lot more light gray in Fort Myers, and then this darker gray as you've added units in Los Angeles over time. So we looked at these 6 foot sea level rise zones and compared the density and the expansion. So this is just the density. And I'm going to take you through a couple of these graphs. So I'm going to just talk through it real quick. This is year on the x-axis and density on the y-axis. And the colors, so the sea level rise zone is this lightest blue. This dark blue is taking, we did this over MSAs, which are metropolitan statistical areas. It's basically the metropolitan area of a city. So we're looking at cities really for this. And so this blue line is the rest of the coastal MSA, not including the sea level rise zone, just to compare like if the sea level rise zone was doing something different than the city. And then the rest is all of the MSAs across the entire country. And so what we can see here is that in density, our sea level rise zones stayed higher density across the whole time period and really expanded in density post 1950 or so, whereas the MSAs and the coastal MSAs and the rest of the country were growing, but a little bit more steady. So our sea level rise zones are definitely denser. If we looked at percent development, which is a measure of the expansion, we can see that that the sea level rise zones are also more developed. So if we take those areas and look at how much they're developed, the percentage of the sea level rise zone that's developed is higher than the other two as well. And then when we take expansion, we can see an interesting pattern, that we saw an earlier increase in expansion in sea level rise zone that then fell off over time, meaning that these communities expanded, but then probably got too big, covered up most of the sea level rise zone that they were trying to expand into, and then started densifying. And that pattern happened later for the other two, but we're really starting to see the expansion drop off for everything over the course of over the whole country. So if we start to look at that, and these are all the MSAs here in the coastal MSAs, we start to look at that for different areas, and then regionally, you can see some different trends pop out. So the first is just looking at the number of structures in the sea level rise zone, and I'm sure you guys are all pointed to this lovely red here in Florida, where we have a lot of structures in the sea level rise zone, unsurprisingly, as well as places in the Northeast and along the California coast. And if we look at this regionally, we can see that the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic had high numbers of structures in sea level rise zones historically, but over time, the Pacific and the Southeastern or South Atlantic coast have really caught up with those and overtaken the Mid-Atlantic and the New England over the course of time. We can also look at this as relative. So what percentage of the total urban area is in the sea level rise zone? What percentage of the structures are in the sea level rise zone? And again, we see South Florida pop out, as well as a couple of other ones. But the interesting thing here is if we look at this regionally, we can see that most of these regions have been decreasing, showing that the sea level rise zone built up, it developed, and then they had to move on to other areas. And so the relative to the rest of the urban area, their proportion was going down versus the South Atlantic, which was still going up. So South Atlantic has seen a lot of growth and development in those areas. We also wanted to look at this with hurricanes to see if there were differences in structure density and built up land depending on the number of hurricanes you have. So these are the coefficient estimates for several regressions that we did. And this zero line is basically an MSA that has no hurricanes. So we're comparing like the no hurricanes to several different scenarios. Out of sea level rise zone, out of sea level rise zone with high severity hurricanes, low severity hurricanes, and then in the sea level rise zone. So basically going up in color, you go from out of the sea level rise zone to in the sea level rise zone, high severity. And as you can see, even places that have high severity, so they've been struck with either a large hurricane or multiple times by hurricanes, they have higher built up land and higher structure density than places that have not, or that are outside of the sea level rise zone, showing that we don't seem to really, or as a society, we are still developing the places that are highly struck by hurricanes, which I think we all know here, being in Florida, and that's what we do, is that, there are places that we rebuild, and we should rebuild in many senses, but are we doing that in a way that's sustainable? And it seems that we have higher density and higher built up land in those areas, so it's a question for us. I also just wanted to show the value of this data set. This is just looking at another characteristic. So this is the percent of structures that are older than 1975. And if you think about time and building regulations and codes, as you go through time, you would expect that building regulations and codes will take hazard into account more and more. So it's a way to look at different areas to see, oh, there's neighborhoods that are older and possibly need to be things that we think about with adaptation or grandfathering in certain adaptations to flooding. So this is Tampa over here. You can see there's like bright blue zones that are really old. And then again, as you would expect in the Northeast, quite a few places that are very, very old. So can we use this data set as a way to target places for adaptation and mitigation to hurricanes and flooding? Okay, so with this, we've seen that exposure has increased along our coastlines. It really depends on where you are about when that happens, but it apparently doesn't matter if you're in a high hazard area or it's still happening. And so how can we make that better, I think, is a big question for policymakers and moving forward. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the alteration of the hazard template and thinking about the geomorphology of our system and what that means for flooding. So how do humans change our hazard template? How do we change our geomorphology that might change the way water moves? So geomorphology as a whole, and I apologize here, we're about to take a turn into geomorphology. So it's going to talk about the template. And when I mean geomorphology, I basically mean the rivers, the canals, the way that water moves across hill slopes, basically the structure that contains the flooding, that contains the water movement across the landscape. So we often base these studies in pristine or natural sites. And when you look at the most cited journal articles across geomorphic literature, first of all, you can see that they are mainly in North America or in Europe. So we're geography is very much based in these places, and that they're mainly natural sites. So the green is a natural study. It's just looking at a seemingly natural area for the geomorphology. Altered is in yellow, both, which is a comparison of two different natural and altered sites. And then we took out climate change because climate change is, in a sense, a type of alteration and a change, but it's not always in an altered template. And when we look at where these studies were done, so again, green is natural, yellow was altered. You can see a couple patterns. First of all, it's predominantly green. So most of these highly cited works are happening in natural environment or natural sites. And that they're mostly in mountains, they're mostly in wet environments, and mostly in timbered environments. So our understanding of our template is really probably skewed towards those things. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of what I mean by altered to prime your head about what we're talking about here. So this is the forested land in the Piedmont of the southeastern United States, which oftentimes looks like this. It's, you know, undulating hills, trees, large trees, and an understory. And this area has been affected by land use change. So the green is hardwood forest and the gray is open. And, you know, as European colonization happened, we see this decrease in the amount of trees as farming land took over, and a subsequent increase in the amount of open land. And then from about 1910 onwards, you start to see a pickup again in trees as farming land kind of got abandoned and trees came back in. What that is meant for this area is a huge way in the way, a huge change in the way that water runs through these areas. So this is a formal farming area with a man standing here, and you can see these giant gullies where you've had water just run off and cause huge erosional gullies in the Piedmont here. And those are still in existence even after the farming is stopped. So this is a reforested area where you can still see this gully running through it, and those gullies are still active and still eroding. So really the movement of a lot of topsoil from the top of those areas into gullies and downstream into the stream network. And this has changed also the way that the stream network looks in these places. So these are taking two transects, one, this top line across a natural site, and the bottom line across one that's been gullied, and you can just see the change in the way that the elevation of these streams happens. The gullies and the streams are very much in size with less of this gradual elevation change, and there's more of them. So changing the way that water runs through these landscapes. We can also think about the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky and West Virginia. And these places have been altered more recently by mountaintop mining. So mountaintop mining is when a coal company comes in and takes the top of a mountain and puts it in the valley to reach a coal seam. So they're going after a coal seam in the middle of this, and it takes all of this previously undisturbed bedrock and puts it down into a valley where it's now basically rubble in this valley. And that can change the way water flows through these places as well. This top one is, these are all discharged. So the amount of water coming out across time. And the top one is natural, and the bottom four are mountaintop mined areas. And what it does is it changes the flashiness of the system. So you have much fewer storm events that cause changes in discharge, and it increases the base flow because water is moving really slowly through these landscapes, these places that are basically rubble that used to be bedrock. And then finally, to the thing that I love the most, talking about salt marshes. So we often think about salt marshes as being kind of these grassy areas where, you know, it might seem like a dinosaur could come out and greet you because they're kind of like prehistoric looking. But in reality, these places are really changed by humans. So this is an example of a mosquito ditch, which we have along the east coast of Florida, as well as all across the northeast United States. The other thing that we have is historic agriculture. So our legacy of slavery means that a lot of these plantations and rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia drained and ditched marshes, and you can still see that in the marshes there as well. So we have these persistent landscapes that have been altered. And when other studies have looked at this, they found, for instance, in the sites that they looked at in the Northeast, 94% of the marshes have been ditched. So this is really pervasive. It's not just like single areas, it's kind of all over the place. And yet we don't really understand what that means for the way that water moves through these systems. So I'm just going to bring up a bunch of questions right now. Again, this is early, work that we're working on currently, and I don't have the answers to all these questions. It's just things that have come to mind for me, and I think they're things that I like to think about. So how pervasive are these altitude landscapes? Is this something that we see everywhere, or is it really a signature of something in the United States or particular places? How do these altered landscapes function? What does that mean for the water moving through them, but also what does that mean for the humans around them? What does that mean for the way that they function for ecosystem services? Over what time scales do they maintain themselves? Is this something that we care about just over human time scales, or is this something that will exist for longer time scales because of the maintenance of those systems through geomorphic processes? And are there consistent, predictable geomorphic shifts and landscapes with similar climates or geology? So for instance, if I'm in a desert and I want to move water because I need water, does that mean that there's going to be canals that look very similar across deserts all over the world? Or is there other ways that people are doing things for places that are wet to move water? That means that there are predictable geomorphic shifts based on climates and geologies. So just to start to begin to nudge at this question, my colleagues and I have again looked at these 4 landscapes: legacy agriculture, mountaintop mining, and marsh ditching in several places across the US or across the eastern US, and just started to look at drainage. Like, what is the water possibly doing in these areas? What does that mean for water movement? And to start with, we'll talk about legacy agriculture. So this is a DEM of 2 places in the Piedmont, one A here that's natural, and B that is the one that's been gullied. And you can just see from the drainage lines the differences in the way that these gullies and water movements happening. This is more sinuous, like more less more gradient of water flow here. Where in B, it's kind of cat scratches. You can see these deep erosional patterns in the landscape. And when we start to look at that in the data, so the novel landforms, that's what we're calling them, these novel landforms are in red, and the natural landforms are in black. When we look at the number of, or the channel head locations, so places where a gully is happening or a stream starts, we look at watershed area. In the novel landforms, those heads are happening at much smaller places, showing that like the drainage area is much smaller for these places, and they're much more small gullies across the landscape. We can also look at this at mountaintop mining, and again, C here is natural and D is the altered. And just looking at the pattern, you can see how inconsistent and kind of crazy this mountaintop mine landscape is, with the river networks all over the place. And when we look at stream length compared to watershed area, and again, novels in red and black is natural, we can see that the length of the stream is much higher for these novel landforms, meaning that there's the water spending a lot more time in that system before moving out, because it's got more, as you can see in that DEM, kind of a crazy route to getting out of that watershed. And then when we look at salt marshes, so we have the natural here at E, and F is the ditch. You can see again, the scratches almost through the landscape where those mosquito ditches are. And we look at per wetland area, so per contiguous area of wetland here, and then the number of outlets, the number of places that water has to move out, that the novel systems have far more outlets per wetland area. So these are really more fast draining systems, and they retain water in a different way than the natural systems. So these 3 examples kind of show the ways that humans have replumbed the landscape, have replumbed our hazard template, right? That we've gone in and we've changed the way that water is moving. Yeah, we don't really exactly know what that means for functioning. So where does this all lead us? We've started to think about this kind of in what is a novel landform? How does it come about? And what does that mean for the ways that we're reassessing use, we're going through restoration, or we're abandoning it? So if we start with the novel landform here in the middle, first of all, there's always like a socioeconomic technological setting that's coming out of. So, for for instance, mosquito ditches were mainly dug in the 1930s by conservation corps because we're in the middle of the New Deal and everybody wanted work. And so they sent them out to dig mosquito ditches. And that's how a lot of mosquito ditches originated. So that was a socioeconomic technological setting that we were in. It's definitely changed now, but that was the reason that the novel landform came about. There's also a climate or geological template. So what you're doing to a system is going to differ depending on whether you're in a desert or whether you're in temperate forest. And so you have to consider that as well. And that really leads to a form or process goal that leads to that novel landform. And then that novel landform often ages over time, as we've seen in our 3 examples. You know, legacy agriculture has a lot of those fields have been abandoned and they've been reforested, or with the ditches, they're no longer really maintaining a lot of those ditches. In some places they're maintained, but a lot of times they're not. And so we either have human maintenance or geomorphic feedbacks that lead to aging novel landform and a new socioeconomic technological setting. So here we are today and now, and we have a different non-stationary template because climate's changing, and it leads to a whole slew of different options that we can do to those. Do we want to restore that system? Do we want to reassess its use and maybe maintain it, or do we want to abandon it? And I think, you know, a good example of maintaining is a dam as a novel landform in a way. It stops a river up, it changes the way that water is moving. And so that would be one that you reassess the use maybe, and you decide you want to keep it. It's also an example of a way that a novel geomorphic feature can cause temporally or spatially distant novel landforms. So that dam changes the way that water moves through the system, which then changes downstream geomorphology, including, for instance, wetlands have been shown to grow based on the sediment contributions of a river. And if you stop the sediment, you can change the growth of that wetland. So it's also something to think about, the way that novel landforms can come about just based on things that are upstream or nearby. So we're really proposing this as a way to move forward, thinking about our template, thinking about the hazard template, thinking about the way that water moves, and trying to come up with ways to think about alterations within the system versus this kind of, you know, bringing it into the geomorphic literature versus thinking of it as a side item and thinking about humans within the system changing it. So coastal ecosystems are altered. These alterations are persistent, as we've, at least through timescale that we probably care about. And they may affect the flooding and buffering of ecosystem services that are provided by that system. So just to kind of sum up where we've been through all of these different topics, and when we just look at all the hazards across the country and the top hazardous areas, the growth into hazardous areas really depends on the geography and where cities occur. But that is also experiencing different types of growth. So whether you're in an earthquake zone or a wildfire zone, you're probably in different types of growth patterns, and that can change the way that we think about policy in those areas. Exposure has increased along our coastline, and we've grown at rates higher than the nation as a whole along our coastline. And even after places are hit by hazards such as hurricanes, we still see growth in those areas, and they tend to be higher than other areas. We also found that coastal systems are altered, and these alterations are persistent through time. And again, this may affect the buffering and the flooding and the ecosystem services of those places, but we're not quite sure how yet. And I'm like really excited about this topic and where it might go, but we're still at the beginning stages of it. So with that, I have not done this in bubble. This is a huge group of people that have helped with all of this. So thank you to all of my co-authors, and especially those who have really pushed me along with this. Oh, and funding sources as well. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yes.
So when you publish work where you're saying, hey, look, people are building in these coastal hazardous zones.
Yeah.
Like insurance companies call you and say, we have your data.
No, because they have better data than we do. We tried to get in touch with Credit Suisse, all people. We had contacts there to get them to work with us, and we were getting somewhere, but then they decided that they didn't need us and that they had better stuff. So I think that's actually the gold mine of data. And if anybody can get them to start sharing their data in some way, that would be amazing, because I think that they have stuff that nobody has. So yeah, we would love that, but it doesn't happen. So. Oh, yes.
I'll follow up on that. How much of that do you think is related to the National Flood Insurance Program? Building.
Yeah, I mean, the National Flood Insurance Program is a whole can of worms. I think that, yeah, I think that, I mean, we all know here in the state that insurance and insurance going forward is a tricky issue. And I think Credit Suisse probably, and insurance companies are probably protecting themselves with the data that they have, because they don't want to give up their cards. As far as the National Flood Insurance Program goes, I think certainly that might be the backstop at some point as people start to leave the market, and that's always like, so, I mean, there's all sorts of problems with that program. So yeah, it's kind of a scary place to be in. And I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm happy to follow it. Okay. Yes.
So I do have a question regarding the second part.
Yes.
Talking about like you have hurricanes and
Mhm.
people going bigger.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Florida has a coastal construction control line program.
Yes.
Which should permits to do that.
Yes.
I was wondering if you know about policies that other states and if that works, if it actually works in Florida and other states.
Yeah, so not a lot of other states have that. There's been studies that shown it's questionable about how well it works. We have not actually looked at that ourselves, but there are studies out there looking at it to see if it works or well or not. I think that there was one example in that study from Florida, or there might have been two, but those were also coming from other states. So I think in this state, we thankfully live in a state where we all have a knowledge about, or most of us have knowledge about these hazards. So I think that policies are a little bit more forward thinking, but they also, they're also just policies, or they're also just experiments in the way that we do things. And so, yeah, definitely something to think about. Yeah. Yes.
I was thinking about age of various houses versus evacuation zones. I don't think that they're.
That's really
incorporated.
interesting.
If you're like a first responder, probably, I'm sure each place has their
Yeah.
perceptions.
Yeah, so we don't actually work with the evacuation zone. I don't think there's an incorporated, but we do have a partner with a group that looks at sending out resources to people after, like it's through 311. So people call up and say, like, I have a huge tree in my yard, or my whole house is flooded. And so they're starting to work with us to try to figure out, like, okay, can we discriminate between the people that have $5 million houses and we'll certainly get this taken care of versus the people that really need this help? And what data can we use in this Zillow data to try to determine where those areas are that probably need the help first versus those that will probably solve it themselves? Because they find that they go to sites and they realize, oh, you've already solved this problem. You just called because you wanted to call. And so it's a waste of resources. So they're trying to figure that out.
Just picture both on the recovery side as well as in forecasting.
Yeah,
side.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Yes.
What's a mosquito ditch?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, sometimes I get a little wrapped up in my own little coastal world and I forget that that's not a clear thing. So people don't like mosquitoes. And so one of the things that people have thought in the past is that salt marshes are breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And so they dug these ditches in the hopes that water would drain faster off the salt marshes and they would have less mosquito problems.
Does it work?
Not really. So the other thing is, like, you're also getting rid of fish, you're also getting rid of the fish that might eat the mosquitoes. So,
That's pretty neat. I've never heard of like a mosquito ditch.
yeah. So they came about again around the New Deal time, where people were really trying to put a lot of people to work at the same time to get out of the Depression. And so they had people, especially in the Northeast, digging mosquito ditches everywhere. And I know that in some counties along the east coast of Florida, they are still maintained. So they are something that people still want.
I was just wondering, what's the efficiency of those mosquito ditches?
For water, or?
Yeah, well, in terms of getting rid of mosquitoes.
Oh, yeah, I don't have any numbers off the top of my head, but there's not huge benefits for them. There are some benefits, but not huge benefits for getting rid of mosquitoes, so. Yeah.
I'm just thinking from perspective of how even if they are less efficient, they are still breeding pools for mosquitoes.
Yeah, I don't like to think of marshes as breeding pools of mosquitoes, because they have natural predators in those areas, right? Like, it's not just a concrete pool where there's nothing in there eating the mosquitoes. It is an ecosystem where there are predators for those mosquitoes. So I think that maybe there are other ways to think about getting rid of mosquitoes other than going after a natural ecosystem to do that. So.
Right, if you have another question, I'm sure Anna doesn't mind staying
No,
here
I
a few
don't.
minutes. You can come up and ask her afterwards. But now we thank her again, and I'll see you.